The email blinked on my phone at 0542. Subject line, Public Acknowledgement Authorized. The language was dry. The kind that pulls blood out of your face. Declassification, approved. Public mention allowed at the discretion of PAO. Details limited for operational security. I stared at the word authorized longer than I needed to. Then set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and zipped the garment bag I hadn't used in years. Fort Liberty had trained me to act without ceremony. San Marcos wasn't a battlefield. But my parents' house had its own terrain, narrow halls. Opinions that filled every room. And 1,000 tiny ambushes disguised as jokes. Tonight wasn't about me. It was Mason's night. First Lieutenant Ward. My kid brother had made it out of ROTC and into a real commission. And I was proud of him. Pride is quiet. That's something people forget. Captain Jenna Coe from PAO called while I was pouring coffee. Colonel Ward. Quick confirm. Color Guard and Mayor's staff will meet curbside at 1900 for a short acknowledgement before the City Hall presentation. No surprises. Sir. No surprises. I said. We keep it clean. Yes. Sir. And if you'd prefer to shift the curbside piece to City Hall, only negative. We'll follow your plan. I didn't add the part where my father would consider anything at City Hall too public, and anything at his doorstep too much. Protocol is a bigger dog than pride. I've learned to let it lead. Traffic down I-35 crawled in pockets. I passed the exit my mother still called by the old name. The strip mall that used to be a feed store. And a church sign promising grace like a coupon. The sun leaned west. Texas light does a thing to the bones of a place. Makes every house confess the color it's been hiding under dust. The banner was impossible to miss. Congrats. LT. Ward. Someone had stapled it to the eaves crooked. The driveway was full. I parked 2 blocks down. Grabbed the wrapped box custom brass bar set. Engraved with his initials and the garment bag. And walked. Every step felt like an old habit I didn't remember choosing. Linda opened the door before I knocked. Hair set. Smile tight. Well. Look who remembered the address. She said. Already turning away. The smell of baked ziti and lemon cleaner wrapped around me like a polite chokehold. Inside. The house hummed. People I half recognized put plates down and picked opinions up. Mason was in the center of it, fresh haircut. Bars gleaming. Posture like he'd been practicing in mirrors. Robert had a glass in his hand and a grin he saved for other people's sons. When he spotted me, he grinned wider. Then adjusted it down to neutral. You made it. He said. Which is not the same as welcome. I did. I said. I held the gift out to Mason. For your bar cart. Real glass. The brass will tarnish if you don't respect it. He took it like a prop in a play he didn't audition for. Nice. He said. Then to the room Big Bro brought me something to practice for the real bar. Laughter did what laughter does when it's searching for permission. A folding chair appeared near the kitchen doorway. Somebody put a paper plate on it with my name in Sharpie, Ethan. The living room set was for core family and closest friends. An elastic category I'd learned not to test. I slid my garment bag behind the chair. Sat down. And watched people move around me like water around rock. Photos started. The photographer. A cousin who bought a DSLR last tax season. Lined everyone up by height and importance. Which is the same thing at gatherings like this. Ward family only. She called. Core. I stood. Took a step. And she lifted a palm without looking at me. We need the uniform up front. Mason. Of course. Not me. I sat back down. Toast number 1 came early. Robert clinked the side of his glass with a butter knife like he was calling a regiment to attention. To my son. He said. Tipping toward Mason. A man who shows up. A man who gives this family something to stand for. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second. Which is exactly how long it takes to say what you don't want on record. Plates moved. A neighbor handed me a tray of mini crab cakes. Would you mind running these around, she asked. Kind in a way that didn't include curiosity. I took the tray. My hands have carried heavier things. When the microphone appeared, why a living room had a microphone is a question for another day. Mason took it naturally. Like the room had been waiting for his voice. He thanked his ROTC cadre by name. Shouted out his best friend who'd covered for him in lab when mornings got rough. And then he smirked into the foam cover. "And to my big brother," he added. "Wherever he disappears to 5 years at a time, thanks for making tonight look easy." It was a line written to sound light and land heavy. It landed. I stood and threaded through the bodies to the hall. "Dad," I said quietly. 2 minutes. Alone. He looked past me as if there were a more interesting version of me behind my shoulder. "Tonight is your brother's night," he said. "You had your chances. I'm not here to take anything from him." I said, "I'm here to add to it." Linda arrived like the end of a scene. "Ethan, this is not the time," she said. "Please don't start." I offered the envelope. PAO letterhead stood out even through the paper. "Just read this." I said, "No one else needs to know. Not tonight." Robert didn't take it. He tapped the envelope with 2 fingers and let it fall back into my palm. "You and your papers," he said. "Always a story. We're not your audience." Back in the living room, the photographer was corralling the last group shot. "We need just parents and the officer," she shouted. "Efficient. Everyone else, step out of frame." I was already out of frame. A gag gift appeared in Mason's hands. He tore the bag open and pulled out a novelty tie printed with tiny resumes. "For my brother," he said, turning to me. "So he can finally get a real job." Laughter again. You could measure its temperature with your skin. I didn't walk out. I didn't correct them. In my unit, we teach men to live inside the breath between insult and reaction. There are things that can only happen in that breath. One of them is choice. My phone buzzed. Capt. KOH. On approach. Honor guard staged. Mayor arriving 1905. Your call. I slid the phone into my pocket and stood. Across the room, Aunt Eileen was watching me with a face that said she had been following a different script all night. She mouthed. "You okay?" I answered with a nod. Robert lifted his glass for one more. "To the son who makes us proud," he said loudly. "And to families who stand for something." In the doorway, the bell rang. The doorbell that cut through Robert's toast wasn't ceremony. It was Valerie from next door with a bundt cake under foil and a breathless apology about traffic on Hopkins Street. She squeezed past me, kissed Linda's cheek, and said, "Can you put this in the kitchen?" Honey. The honey wasn't for Linda. It was for me. I took the cake the way you take a note you didn't write and slid toward the counter. The folding chair by the doorway was still mine. Name scrawled in Sharpie on a paper plate. Every other seat had a cloth napkin folded like a promise. Someone had set a glass of water on my plate as if I were training for permission. Mason stood on the rug where the camera light was best. A cluster of bodies orbiting him. His bars catching the warm bulbs like they were built for it. The photographer called for another lineup: parents, siblings, closest friends. I stepped. And she didn't look at me when she said, "Just immediate." Please. The word immediate has a way of editing people out. Linda floated to the doorway and caught my eye. "Can you grab more ice?" she said. Then, as if to sand it down, added, "Please." The garage freezer was where it had always been. Dicky with summer and stacked with things they kept for never. I hauled 2 bags into the kitchen, cracked them on the edge of the sink, and poured the ice into the silver tub like I was filling a well I'd been warned not to drink from. On my way back to the living room, I placed the PAO envelope on the console table beneath the mirror. The letterhead sat there like a quiet animal. Linda's hand brushed the corner as she passed, flattening it under a stack of mailers and church bulletins until only a corner of the seal showed. I told myself it was practicality. I told myself a lot of things. "Ethan, help me with the trays." A cousin called from the dining room. She handed me prosciutto on toothpicks and a tone I recognized from checkouts and coat rooms. "You can make a lap before the next toast." Right, I could. I did. Conversations lifted and dipped around me. Training stories Mason had already learned to tell with the rhythm of applause. Robert repeating, "He shows up," as if it were scripture. Aunt Eileen stopped me at the archway and asked for a napkin, which gave her an excuse to hold me in the doorway for an extra second. "Your mother is nervous," she said. "Don't know why. Feels like we're all dancing on a table that's a little too small." I nodded. The napkin she took was empty. That was the point. By the time I made it back to the console, the envelope had migrated again, tucked beneath a basket of thank you cards. I lifted the basket an inch, slid the envelope to the top where the seal could breathe, and left it there. Robert brushed past and set his glass down on it. A wet circle forming on DoD letterhead. Gotta love condensation, he said, smiling at the room. Family picture. The photographer called. Corps ward parents and the officer. She swiveled her wrist toward Mason like a traffic wand. Officer, I said under my breath. Not loud enough to change anyone's definitions. Dinner happened the way theater happens, lights up. Hit your marks. Pretend you're not pretending. I took my place at the folding chair and found it had been moved a little further back so the server could get through. I pulled it forward enough not to disappear entirely. Mason's best friend slapped him on the shoulder and said something about real service and commitment. And he laughed the way people laugh when they've never had to buy it themselves. Linda leaned over me with a pitcher of tea. Sweet or unsweet, she asked. Water's fine. I said. We have plenty. She said, as if the answer were somewhere inside generosity. I took the tea. It tasted like July. They passed a microphone again. I don't know who brought it, but it had found its purpose. Mason thanked everyone for making space for his night. He talked about Fort Sill, about mornings in the rain, about a mentor who told him men were measured by the hours they showed up and the hours they stayed. I plan to stay, he said. And eyes fell in a line that ended where I was sitting. You can feel a stare even when it's pretending to be a sentence. Say grace, Linda asked Robert. But he tilted his chin at Mason. Let the officer do it. Mason bowed his head and put on the voice he uses in rooms he thinks he owns. The prayer was short and efficient. He tucked in an extra sentence about those serving far away that sounded generous until he glanced at me in the middle of it and smiled like a man closing a gate. We ate. We listened. We performed family. When plates cleared, someone put on a playlist. The photographer started corralling for fun shots. Let's do brothers, she said, and motioned me forward. I stepped beside Mason, and she adjusted her lens with a frown. Actually, can I get just the officer first? I backed out of frame and watched the shutter fire 3 times in a cadence I know from other cameras. After the 3rd shot, she glanced over. Okay. We can do one with both. But fast. We're losing light. We did it fast. That was the point too. In the hallway. I intercepted Robert as he refilled his glass. Dad, I said softly. I meant it when I said I can help him. There are people I can call. Doors I can open. No parades. No speeches. Just work. He kept pouring. He doesn't need a shortcut. He said. He needs to be seen. Being seen and being good aren't the same. I said. In this house. He said. Capping the bottle. They start in the same place. I took the envelope and held it out again. This isn't a parade. It's protocol. Read it. If you still want me to shut up after, I'll shut up. He tapped the seal with the back of his fingernails. I've read enough of your stories. None of my stories have this seal. I said, and set the envelope on his palm. He let it sit there a second, and then slid it toward the fruit bowl without opening it. A grape rolled and knocked against the edge like a soft gavel. Back in the living room, a cousin shoved a novelty apron into my hands. Grill Sergeant. In block letters. I could feel the room tense in anticipation of whether I would laugh or not. I slipped it over my head and tied it behind my back. Someone exhaled. The room loosened by a notch. Out on the patio, the propane grill flared and smoked. And for a mercy of 2 minutes I had a task that didn't require interpretation. The apron text was a joke, and a truth smashed together. The truth didn't mind. Through the glass I could see Mason standing on the hearth. Microphoned again. Robert and Linda flanking him like bookends. People were turning toward them without being asked. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Capped KOH. We're staged 3 houses down per your earlier note. Mayor's car 2 minutes out. Your call if you want curbside or city hall only. I typed 3 words, hold for signal. Inside. The photographer was gathering the oldest generation for a picture. Aunt Eileen waved me in and then shook her head when the photographer frowned. We'll do another. The photographer said, which is American for never. Eileen took my hand anyway and squeezed it once. A small transmission of current, not pity. Not advice. Just proof of life. Are you okay? She asked. I'm not the one anyone should be worrying about. I said. Sometimes worry is a way of loving. She said. Sometimes it's a way of being loud. A neighbor brushed past with a tray and stopped when she saw my apron. Oh good. She said. Can you clear the glasses outside when you get a second? I nodded. There's dignity in doing a thing well. Even when the thing is small. Especially then. I set the envelope back on the console as I re-entered. Angled where a man who wanted to ignore it would have to do it on purpose. Mason caught my eye from the hearth and smirked. A private stage bow. He tapped the mic head twice. And the room settled on cue. To everyone who came. He said. Thank you. To those who keep showing up. I see you. He lifted his glass toward Robert and Linda. To the people who taught me what a name stands for. Then he turned. Slow enough that it read as swagger. And let his eyes find me. And to those who drift. A reminder that uniforms don't make men. Showing up does. The laugh was smaller this time. But it still showed up. It always does. I felt the muscle memory in my jaw pull toward some old edge and made it unclench. I was not here to be a sermon for them. I was here to be a wall. I slipped into the hallway and dialed. Captain Coe. I said when she picked up. Hold one more block. When you see the porch light blink twice, send the color guard to the door. Mayor stays curbside until I give you the go. Yes. Sir. Copy. I killed the call and looked back at the room. Robert was raising his glass again, and the photographer was backing up for a wider shot, directing people with little chopping motions of her hand. I could feel the night tilting toward the part where words learn whether they're bones or fog. I stepped to the console, placed 2 fingers on the envelope, and pushed it half an inch closer to the room. It wasn't a dare. It was a courtesy. If they wanted to know, they could know. If they wanted to laugh, they could. If they wanted to finish the night on their preferred script, they were going to get the chance to do it. Linda caught me in the reflection of the mirror and, for one heartbeat, looked like she saw someone she recognized. Then she turned back to the rug where Mason stood, bright and close to his light. And I stayed where I was at the threshold of the house. Exactly where everyone had decided I belonged. The oven timer chimed. People laughed at some line I didn't catch. The ice in the tub cracked and settled. I waited for the porch light to mean something again. Someone turned the music down just enough for the voices to carry. The living room narrowed. Conversations braided themselves into a rope I could feel on my shoulders. Tyler, the best friend with the easy grin and the empty weekends, clapped his hands and said, Quick game while the ZD cools service edition. 2 truths and a lie. He pointed at Mason. You start. Lieutenant. Mason took a swig from a highball he shouldn't have been holding in uniform, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, Okay. I did land nav in a thunderstorm. I roughed it a week in the field without a shower. And my brother once finished something he started. Laughter came hot and quick. The kind that doesn't ask permission. Come on. Tyler said. Too easy. Last one's the lie. He turned toward me and raised his glass. We love you. Man. He added. Like a bandage after the cut. Uncle Gary shouldered in from the kitchen with a beer and a story. He's the type who thinks humor is a tool you swing until it hits something. Back in my day. He started. Which is how you know it won't be about his day. We had real operators, you could spot them by the calluses. No offense. Ethan. He said. Eyes bright for the offense. But if you were ever an operator, I'm a ballet dancer. What is it you do again, Black Ops? Uber hauling, secrets around town. He nudged me in the ribs with his elbow, like that proved we were friends. Gary. Aunt Eileen said quietly, What, we're family. He said. Which is the American phrase for permission to forget manners. Linda slid in, wiping an invisible spot off a spotless counter. Ethan. She said. Can you take out the recycling? The bin's overflowing. She caught my look and added, Softer. Please. I took the bin. Aluminum chimed against aluminum. The night air outside tasted like mesquite and someone else's celebration. When I came back in, a circle had formed around Mason near the fireplace. The microphoned voice had found its channel again. He talked about the field exercise at Fort Sill, how he'd taped his feet to keep from blistering, how the cadre had said, "Men show up where it's hard. It's not about uniforms," he said, finding me without looking at me. "It's about presence." Tyler clapped. Robert gave that proud nod. Men practice alone in bathrooms. On the far end of the sofa, my cousin Lila had her phone up. Her thumb moved like a metronome. A red dot pulsed in the corner of the screen. Live. Senshi. She panned past Mason, past Robert and Linda, and caught me in the frame long enough for comments to float. "Who's that? Thought only one son. Old dude looks mad." Lila didn't mean anything by it. She never does. She means everything by it. 2. "Speech," someone shouted. From the officer, the camera swung back to Mason. He obliged. "I want to thank everyone who kept me honest," he said. "My parents, who showed me what consistency looks like." Eyes slid to Robert and Linda. "My brothers in arms who taught me how to show up. Not just when it's flashy. Not just when a camera's on." The room hummed along. He took another drink. A swallow too large. And his cheeks pinked. "Some of us," he said, "show up in real life. Others show up in stories." The sentence frayed in the air. Lila's comments crawled oof. "Savage. Is he talking about?" Lol. I could have moved. I could have stepped forward and asked for the mic and cut a small, clean circle around the moment. But there's a difference between controlling a room and choosing yourself. Tonight was about the second thing. "Ethan," Linda said, appearing at my elbow. "If you have time, can you refill the cooler?" She gestured toward the patio. I nodded and took the tray. You can carry a thing without carrying what it stands for. On the porch, I lifted the lid and listened to the ice crack under the weight of new cans. Through the glass. The living room was a diorama people arranged into certainty. The kind you get when you all agree what you're looking at. My phone buzzed. Capt KOH Mayor on curb. Standing by. "Your call. Hold." I typed again and slid the phone back. Inside. Robert had the mic for a father's toast. He is good at the posture of leadership. He squared his shoulders, set his jaw, and let silence build until even the children at the coffee table looked up. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate a man who makes it easy to be proud. A man who shows us, by example, what our name can stand for." He raised his glass toward Mason. "To my son who stands with us." I felt the "with us" pass through the room like electricity around a grounded wire. "Dad," I said softly from the doorway. He didn't turn. 2 minutes. I tried again. Linda touched my forearm without looking and said, "Ethan, not tonight. The way you quiet a child in church." Lila, still live, still filming, drifted toward me. "Smile," she whispered. "People in the comments think you're a mystery." She giggled. "You could at least wave and make it friendly. Turn it off." Aunt Eileen said from a chair I hadn't noticed she'd taken. "Now." Lila rolled her eyes, ended the stream, and mouthed, "Relax." To no one in particular, she saved the video. Because that is what people do when they decide the future for other people. Dinner plates clinked. The photographer, high on the thin air of authority, called for a funny face photo. Grown adults contorted their mouths and lifted their brows and made proof that sometimes childhood never ends. It just gets louder and buys a house. Someone slipped a paper crown on Mason's head. He accepted it like it had weight. "Career advice corner," Tyler announced. Only half joking. "Let's help the old man out." He pointed at me. "Ethan, if you ever want a steady gig, my dad's hardware store needs stockers. Military discount gets you 15% on boots." He grinned as if he'd solved me. Robert smiled at the joke without breaking a sweat. "There's no shame in starting somewhere," he said, in the tone of a man who thinks he is offering a ladder, or standing still. Uncle Gary added, "Elbow ready." I set the cooler lid down. "I'm fine," I said. "I have work." "Stories aren't work," Gary said. "We all got stories, Gary." Eileen warned. I looked over at Mason. He lifted his glass a fraction. We had been boys together once, river water. Cut knees. A plastic BB gun that stung like summer. That version of us was somewhere behind his eyes and somewhere behind mine. It didn't come to the surface. Ethan, Linda said softly, almost kindly. We know you've been trying. It's just Mason is here. He's present. That matters. It does. I said. Then let it matter. She said. Her fingers brushed the PAO envelope as she turned. She didn't move it this time. Maybe she thought it belonged to the table now. The way my chair belonged to the doorway. Tyler pulled out a small foam trophy from under the coffee table. Where do people keep these things and read the gold sticker? Attendance award. He looked at me. Then at Mason. Indecision flickering. To the man who shows up, he said finally. Handing it to Mason. Laughter again. Lighter. The kind that makes space for itself and sets down roots. I didn't touch my glass. I didn't touch anything for a minute. In the kitchen. The oven timer beeped itself hoarse. Linda hurried past. And on reflex I reached for the mitts and pulled the tray to the stovetop before it burned. She paused. Surprised. Then nodded once in acknowledgement that didn't travel further than the tile. My phone buzzed once more. Capped KOH. We can shift to City Hall only. Sir. Cleaner. Your call. I stared at the porch light through the glass. Texas dusk does that trick where it hangs blue for a beat before it drops. Like a stagehand has a finger on the dimmer and wants you to notice the act. The room lifted for another toast. The last cork like a small report. Robert's voice rose. Mason's friends cheered. Lila. Denied a live audience. Aimed her front-facing camera at herself and rehearsed a caption. Ethan. Aunt Eileen said. And her voice cut through everything without being loud. What do you need right now? I thought about the word need until it didn't mean anything. I looked at the envelope and at the door where the night waited to choose its own speed. I heard the low idle of a city car a few houses down. I watched my brother's mouth shape gratitude and swagger into the same syllable. I put my hand on the wall switch by the kitchen doorway. The porch light stared back at me. Steady and ordinary. As if it were just a bulb and not a lever. I didn't flip it. Not yet. The air conditioner kicked on. The house exhaled. Somewhere behind me. Uncle Gary started another story with, back in my day. People laughed ahead of the punchline like they'd already agreed to. In the mirror over the console. I caught my own face long enough to see a man who could end the night in 12 seconds or let it run out of itself. I dropped my hand from the switch and stepped back into the doorway. The room kept performing. The ice settled. The envelope waited. When the timer on the coffee urn chirped, Linda motioned to the stack of cups and said, Ethan. Can you? And I said, I can. Because I could. And because there are 100 ways to hold a line that don't look like holding it. I poured coffee for people who didn't look up, and for people who did. Robert raised his glass one more time. Mason bowed as if the applause were a kind of weather. I took my place at the threshold again, and let the moment be what it meant to be before it became something else. Outside. A car door clicked shut. The porch light went on and then off. Once. On its own timer. I watched it steady itself and waited for the second blink. The second toast should have been harmless watered tea in plastic cups and a line about hard work. But Robert gripped the mic like a gavel and let the room quiet until even the playlist went still. He stood with his back to the fireplace. Chin up. The same posture he used when he told us to rake the yard as kids. Family. He said. And people straightened as if the word had a spine. Tonight we celebrate a son who represents us. A man who shows up. A man who puts our name where it belongs. Mason lowered his eyes at the compliment. Letting it stick. Tyler punched his shoulder like a coach after a clean hit. Linda hovered a step behind Robert. Hands folded in that way that tells the room which side is the sacred one. Robert continued. We've learned something the past few years. A family cannot carry what refuses to stand. A name cannot be stretched to cover absence. He didn't look at me when he said it. Which is how a person looks when they mean it most. A murmur moved across the carpet agreement. Relief. The sound people make when someone else says what they were tired of holding in. I felt the edge of the console table press into my hip. The PAO envelope lay there. Half visible under a raft of glossy mailers. A bead of condensation from Robert's glass had bloomed into a damp ring over the crest. "From this day forward," Robert said, voice tightening at the hinge of the words, "this family stands publicly with the son who stands with us. Silence has grades. This one came heavy and clean. Even Uncle Gary shut his mouth. Somewhere a fork tapped a plate twice and stopped. Embarrassed. I could feel Aunt Eileen's eyes before I saw her. She was seated near the end of the sofa, one ankle hooked behind the other like she was bracing. She looked at me steadily. "The way you look at a horizon to keep from getting seasick. Is there something we don't know?" she asked. Not loud. Not small. Not tonight. I didn't say. Not from me yet. I didn't say. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A small electric nudge. Capped KOH Mayor curbside. Color guard in position. "Your signal when ready. We can move to City Hall if you prefer." Robert lifted his glass. "To our son," he said again. "To the people who choose us." He drank. The room drank. I didn't. Lila had her phone out again. Thumb hovering over the live button. Eyes cutting to me like I was the cutaway shot that would make the caption work. Aunt Eileen reached across the coffee table slow, deliberate, and set her hand over Lila's camera. "Not now," she said, and left her palm there long enough for the choice to register. Linda found my elbow with a coffee cup. "Could you top this off?" she asked. Softer than earlier, almost as if the softness could undo the contour of the last sentence. I took the cup and poured. The urn hissed and clicked. A machine version of a sigh. "Say it." Tyler stage whispered from Mason's flank. "Say the line again." He meant the line about showing up. Mason smiled and didn't. He didn't have to. The line had already been said for him. I stepped into the hall. It felt like stepping out of weather into a draft. My thumb hovered over Captain Coe's text. I typed, "Hold 1 more minute." Then I deleted minute. Typed moment. Deleted that. And put the phone away. The porch light switch was cool under my fingertips. I pulled my hand back like I'd touched a rail too early. Back in the living room. The photographer was arranging a parents and officer shot again. "Core only," she called. And people flowed into place as if poured. She looked up at me once. Then past me. To the hearth where Mason was already standing. "Good," she said to no one and everyone. "That's the frame." Robert stepped closer to the mic without asking for it. He stood next to Mason so the comparison could happen without words. "A man owes the uniform more than a presence," he said. "He owes it consistency." He waited. Then added, "Thank you, son, for being consistent." I heard a cousin whisper. Finally, someone says it. As if the room had been carrying a secret it didn't even know it wanted to share. Aunt Eileen's voice cut through again. This time from closer. She had moved without me seeing her move. "Robert," she said. "That's enough." It wasn't a plea. It was a sentence with a period and no room for footnotes. Robert didn't turn. Linda did. For 1 second her face was not a mask and then it was again. She pinched the bridge of her nose. The way she does when the oven timer and the phone ring at the same time. Mason cleared his throat into the mic. "I'm grateful," he said, landing on the right word like a practiced step. "It's a privilege to serve." He looked at me then, straight on for the first time all night, and smiled like the end of a handshake you don't feel in your hand. "I hope to earn it every day." Now that's a line. Tyler said. A chair scraped. The AC cycled. My folding chair sat half in the doorway, half in the kitchen, right where that in-between life was supposed to live. The paper plate with my name tilted, slid, caught against the seat, and held there like a label that didn't want the job anymore. "Dessert," Linda announced into the mic. She hadn't realized she was near. It squealed, and someone laughed, grateful for a piece of normal to put into their mouth. She set the mic down. Too quickly. And it rolled. Thumped. Rested against the baseboard. I edged toward the console and lifted the envelope again. Felt its weight. The grain of the paper under my thumb. You can put your whole life in an envelope and watch people use it as a coaster if you let them. I slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. If there was going to be a readout in this house, it would be done by the book, not the buffet. "Ethan," Robert said suddenly, surprising the room as much as he surprised me by saying my name. He turned partway toward me. Just enough to make it count. If you'd like to say a few words. You're welcome. Let's keep it to congratulations. He was loaning me a place to stand and charging interest. I looked at Mason. He held the mic out to me like a dare or an olive branch. I couldn't tell which because sometimes they are carved from the same tree. I took one step forward and felt the floor find my weight. The mic cable arced like a lasso between us. I stopped one step short of taking it. Congratulations, I said, not lifting my voice, not lowering it. Serve well. Remember that the people who can't see you are often the ones you serve best. A breath passed through the room like someone had opened a window. Tyler made a face like he wasn't sure if he'd been insulted or blessed. Mason nodded, as if an answer had been acceptable, and therefore would be accepted. Robert's mouth settled into a line he thought was neutral. Linda folded a napkin until it became a small, tight square. Aunt Eileen touched my sleeve. Is there something we don't know? She asked again. Getter. Closer. The question now personal instead of public. There will be things you can hear. I said. There are things you can't. Not because I don't want you to. Because that's the cost of how I have lived. She studied me like she was reading a label for the first time, and realizing she'd been eating the product for years. Lila's phone chimed 3 rapid notes that mean a post has begun to climb. She glanced down. Then away. Guilty without the shelf to put the guilt on. Just checking comments. She said to air that didn't need to be told. Coffee. Linda said to no one. To me. To the space between us. We need more coffee. She moved toward the urn and nearly knocked the envelopeless mail stack to the floor. Papers slid. Church bulletin on top like a flag on laundry. My phone buzzed once more. Capped KOH, sir, we can adjust. Mayor is flexible for 10. Your call. 10 minutes is a long time or no time at all. Depending on the weather of a room. I answered, stand by. Then I put the phone away again and lifted the tea pitcher and walked it to the folding chair that had been mine and refilled the plastic cups that had been assigned to me. You can choose where to stand even when someone else thinks they have already chosen for you. Robert returned to the mic as if the moment had behaved and could be expected to keep behaving. Blessings, he said, the word rounding his voice. We're fortunate to have clarity tonight. Clarity is a word like glass. It's useful until it cuts. I kept my eyes on the porch light switch by the kitchen doorway and felt the pulse in my thumb line up with something outside the house. Aunt Eileen exhaled like she'd been holding a note. Linda stacked cups. Careful. Precise. Like each one could break, and she would be the one to sweep it. Cake. Someone said brightly. And the spell cracked enough for movement. Eileen leaned in one last time. Voice made for me alone. Ethan. She said. Are you okay? I'm where I'm supposed to be. I said. Here, she asked. At the line. I said. The room surged toward dessert. The mic slept against the baseboard. The porch light waited. Blank as a moon. I rested my fingers on the switch and felt the weight of a minute sit down next to me. The coffee urn clicked. Someone laughed. Someone else said hush. I didn't blink. The house did it for me. Dessert plates moved like small white moons. And the room adjusted its orbit. The laughter was thinner now. Stretched over a frame that had started to creak. I watched the porch light through the glass of the back door. My hand still remembering the switch. And told myself there was one conversation left to try before I turned the night into something else. I found Robert by the hallway thermostat, studying it as if temperature were a moral question. Dad, I said. Quiet enough not to pull eyes. 2 minutes. Just us. He kept his gaze on the little screen. Make it one. In a week. I said. Mason's going to be in rooms where a single call changes whether he waits 6 months for a slot or 6 weeks. I can make those calls. Not to hand him anything, just to put his name in the right stack. Robert finally looked at me. I don't want right stacks. Ethan. I want the right son to be seen doing the right work. He won't start his career under the shadow of whatever it is you do. Whatever it is I do. Kept more than one boy's name off a wall. I said. And left it there. Linda approached with a serving spoon and a smile that looked tired of being a smile. Ethan. If this is about you, it's not. I said. It's about letting me be useful to him. Useful. Robert's mouth curled like the word had a flavor. You show up for one night every 5 years and ask to be useful. He doesn't need favors. He needs presence. I'm offering work, I said. Not favors. Mason's voice came from behind us. The kind of entrance you hear before you see. I can speak for myself. He stepped into the hallway. The crown of paper now gone. Cheeks still a little pink. Tyler's laugh receded behind him like a siren fading. I don't want your help, he said. I'm not riding coattails. I earned this. You earned a commission. I said. Good. Now you have to earn a career. Everyone gets help. The trick is choosing the kind that doesn't cost your spine. Mason smirked. We both know the cost you pay is never showing up. You don't get to waltz in and anoint me. I'm not anointing you. I said. I'm trying to keep you from learning the hard way that pride is a poor mentor. Then let me learn. He said. Preferably without an audience that thinks you're a phantom. Linda's hand found his shoulder. Boys, she said, forgetting we were grown men. Please. Tonight is a celebration. Robert glanced down the hall toward the living room, and then back at me. We're done here, he said. No calls. No strings. No special introductions. No parade. I said. Just a recommendation. No, he said. And there was relief in his voice. As if he'd finally put weight on a decision he'd been carrying around like a limp. The photographer materialized at the mouth of the hallway. Camera strap cutting a diagonal from shoulder to hip. Family shot on the stairs. She sang. With the clipped cheer of someone paid by the hour. Parents and the officer first. I stepped with them. Not because I belonged in that frame, but because the hallway had turned into a chute. The bottom step was already staged, Linda's hand on the banister. Robert's jaw set. Mason centered as if the wood had been cut to his measurements. I took the step just above Linda and felt the photographer's hand on my sleeve. Gentle and firm at once. Just parents and officer, she repeated, and tugged me out of the rectangle. It was the kind of polite you remember more than an insult. As I stepped back, Uncle Gary's voice floated from the dining room. Useless is still useless, even when he wears a suit. It wasn't a shout. But the room had gone quiet enough for the mic on the speaker by the hearth to catch it and serve it back. People pretend not to hear an echo when it embarrasses them. They're never good at it. Lila's phone tilted down. Tyler said ouch like it was a punchline. Then realized it wasn't, and coughed into his fist. Aunt Eileen stood at the base of the stairs and said, Gary. Apologize. With a tone that didn't ask for a vote, Gary lifted his hands in a parody of surrender. Kidding, he said. Can't take a joke. You shouldn't come to a party. Then, don't make jokes that need an apology baked into them. Eileen said, and for a moment I saw the woman who had pulled me out of the Blanco River when I was 9. Hands strong and sure. No patience for current. Mason stared at the floor, which I gave him credit for. He didn't look at me and grin, which would have been easier. Linda stroked the banister with her thumb like it were rosary beads. Robert cleared his throat. And the photographer clapped her hands twice, unpaid authority doing its best. The shutter clicked. Once. Twice. 3 times. Let's get all the cousins. The photographer said quickly. Fun shot. I slipped out of the traffic and into the kitchen. The urn hissed. The oven's residual heat breathed. I leaned both hands on the counter and felt the laminate imprint into my palms. My phone buzzed. Capt KOH, Sir Mayor can wait 8 more. Then we'll go to City Hall. Your call. 8 minutes. I looked at the porch light switch. At the envelope ridge under the lining of my jacket. At the hallway where my last attempt had landed and stayed. I walked back toward the stairs. And when Robert stepped off the bottom stair, I matched his path with mine so that we met on the landing where the carpet frayed. Dad. I said. Steady. There's going to be a brief visit at the curb. It will be respectful. No speeches inside. Read the letter before they arrive. Robert's eyes thinned. We don't need the city to bless our house, he said. We already blessed what needed blessing. This isn't about blessing. I said. It's about accuracy. You mean about you, he said. A man who does decent work doesn't need announcements. A man who does certain work doesn't get a vote about announcements. I said. I didn't ask for this piece. I asked for 10 minutes of courtesy, and for you to read the envelope, so you're not surprised. Surprise is your specialty, he said, and stepped around me. Selection made. Linda lingered at the bottom stair. If you want to help him, she said softly, looking over my shoulder so she wouldn't have to look at me. Show up for holidays. Call your mother. Remember birthdays. Those are the doors you can open. I've been where phones don't work, I said. And I've been where calls make things worse. Then maybe don't pick work like that, she said, and bit the inside of her cheek as if the taste would remind her to be kind. Mason appeared again, plate in hand. 2 forks stuck into the cake slice like little flags. We done? He asked, not waiting for an answer. Because I told Tyler we'd grab a drink at Riley's after this. You're in uniform, I said. Off the clock, he said. Mostly. There's no mostly in uniform, I said, and heard myself become the kind of man my brother would ignore on principle. Thanks for the briefing. Sergeant Apron, he said, and brushed past me. And for a second I wasn't standing in my parents' house anymore. I was standing outside a plywood door in a country where plywood doors are promises no one means to keep. And a young man laughed as if he were bulletproof, and I knew exactly how wrong he was. Aunt Eileen took my arm lightly, redirecting me back into the living room before the house could decide I was a problem. Come sit, she said. And I realized my folding chair had been nudged farther back again, almost to the tile. I dragged it 2 inches forward and let the legs scrape. The sound said I was still here. Robert raised his glass near the hearth. One last word, he announced. Gratitude. He said it like he owned the patent. It's a good night when a family knows where it stands. I stood. Not because I intended to speak, but because sometimes you have to test whether your legs remember you. They did. I moved to the kitchen doorway, reached for the switch, and felt the weight of the room shift onto a fulcrum the size of my thumb. I blinked. The porch light did not. I flipped it down and up twice. Once. Twice. Outside. 2 car doors closed. Measured and even. The hum of an engine idled down. Somewhere a neighbor's dog decided to be quiet. I slid the envelope out of my jacket and felt the paper again. The way a man pats his pockets for keys right before leaving. Ethan, Linda said behind me. Alarm in my name for the first time all night. It'll be respectful, I said. 10 minutes. The doorbell rang. Not loud, but with a tone that turned heads. The room's conversation paused on an inhale. Robert's jaw set. Mason's eyes flicked to mine. Then away. I opened the door. 2 uniforms stood on my parents' porch, framed by Texas Dusk 4-person joint service color guard in dress. 2 rifle bearers flanking the U.S. flag and the Texas flag, plus a captain in Class A with a leather portfolio and a deputy from the sheriff's office posted on the walkway. Behind them at the curb idled a black city sedan with a small magnetic seal on the door. My mother's wreath swayed once, like the house had exhaled. Good evening, the captain said. Voice, even. Captain Jenna Coe. Public Affairs. With your permission. Sir. Ma'am. We have a brief, authorized acknowledgement for Colonel Ethan Ward before the City Hall presentation. We can keep it at the threshold if you prefer. Her eyes slid from Robert to me without lingering too long on either. The rifles lowered half a breath to parade rest. The sheriff's deputy lifted a palm toward a neighbor who'd wandered onto the sidewalk. A quiet signal to give the scene a little air. Robert did not move. This is a family home, he said. Each word ironed crisp. We're in the middle of something. Yes. Sir. Coe said. 10 minutes. No speeches inside. By the book. Mayor Grant is waiting at the curb for the public portion. Your call on the location of this readout. Linda's hand compressed the doorframe. Is this necessary, she asked. But the necessary had already arrived and was standing on her welcome mat. Aunt Eileen stood up from the sofa behind me and, because she had never learned how to be timid, said, Robert, step aside and let them do their job. Mason took 2 steps into view. Ty loosened a notch. Mouth ready for a grin that didn't decide to show up. Is this a joke? He said. Because if it is, it's a good one. It isn't. I said. Tyler's voice landed from the rug. Dude. What is happening? A sentence that belonged to a different house. Lila's phone materialized at chest height like a moth. The red ring glowed. No live broadcast inside the residence. Please. Ko said. Not sharp. Just a statement set down where it would be found. We'll have public footage at City Hall. Lila lowered the phone. Cheeks bright. Sorry, she said. To the room more than to the officer. Ko looked to Robert again. Sir. Your permission to step inside the threshold for the readout. This was the hinge. You can feel a house make a decision like a knee deciding to hold. Robert's jaw clicked once. He looked at me as if asking whether I would turn this moment into one more thing he'd have to dislike. I kept my voice level. 10 minutes. I said. Respectful. Then we moved to the curb. Sheriff Torres leaned into view through the screen. Hat in his hand. Evening. Folks. He said. We'll be quick and tidy. It was the voice that keeps parades from tripping over strollers. Robert stepped back one shoe length. It was not consent so much as gravity. Ko nodded once to her team. Colors. She said softly. Halt. Boots landed not loud, but precise just past the threshold. Heels aligned to the edge of the entry rug. Steel furniture and wood floor spoke to each other in a language of clicks and hushes. Linda's eyes pinned themselves to the rifles. These are ceremonial, Ko said quickly. Cleared and sealed. I stood at the side of the hallway. Not in front of anybody, and not behind anybody either. The color guard lifted their eyes to a point 10 inches above the far wall. The way you do when you've learned how to look at a room without asking it a question. Ko opened the portfolio and produced a single sheet on letterhead that had spent the day in a government printer. She did not hand it to anyone. She held it herself and looked to me. Colonel. She said. Captain. I answered. Location. I glanced at the hearth where Mason had made the house stop and start all night with a microphone and a smile. Then I looked at the strip of floor between the console and the front door where the shoes lived. Here. I said. At the line. Ko faced the room. By authorization of the Department of the Army, and in coordination with Joint Special Operations Command Public Affairs, this is a brief acknowledgement of public declassification pertaining to Colonel Ethan Ward. She said the words like, she had to walk each one across a river. Operational details remain restricted. This statement affirms identity and prior command for the purpose of local recognition. Uncle Gary opened his mouth. Sheriff Torres lifted 2 fingers from the walkway without looking at him. And Gary's mouth closed like someone had cut its power. Tyler sat down on the arm of a chair he had no right to sit on and stared as if television had stepped out of itself. Robert tried one last angle. Is there a way to postpone this until another night, he asked. It sounded like trying to ask a storm to wait until morning. Ko's answer was almost gentle. No. Seer. We are within the authorized window. We'll keep it respectful. Mason had retreated half a step toward the hearth. He looked smaller by 1 notch. The way a man does when the light changes and he realizes it isn't his to aim. Linda stood with her fingers pressed into her apron like she could lift the whole house and hold it steady. Please, Ko said. And she wasn't talking to any one person. If we could ask for quiet. The house did a thing I had never seen it. Do it obeyed. Present one of the rifle bearers began, then checked himself at a look from Ko. She gave a small shake of the head. Like not in a living room. The flags remained at rest. The rifles stood for what they were meant to stand for, and no more. Lila. Hands empty now. Moved closer to Aunt Eileen, as if distance from her phone required proximity to a person. Eileen reached up and found my sleeve again. A habit that had discovered itself over the last hour. Ko turned slightly toward the door. Mayor Grant will speak at the curb after this acknowledgement. Sheriff Torres is keeping the walkway clear. We'll be under 10. Get on with it. Gary muttered. And someone, maybe his wife. Maybe his conscience made a sound that stopped him from finishing the thought. Robert squared himself as if he could meet protocol with posture. If you must, he said, trying to sound like he hadn't already lost the tone. I must, Ko said. And then, almost like a human being instead of an institution, it will be over before your coffee cools. A wind pressed the wreath once more and let it go. The porch light held. Somewhere on the curb, a car door clicked as the mayor shifted in her seat and looked at a wristwatch. The room collected itself. On behalf of the Department of Defense, Ko said, lifting the page to eye height, we acknowledge Colonel Ethan Ward for distinguished service in assignments now declassified in part, including command of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta Airborne. The words entered the room the way rain enters a county that has decided it doesn't need rain. Carefully, stubbornly. Then, all at once, Mason blinked. Linda made a sound with her throat that could have been a yes or a no. Robert's eyes left my face and tracked to the paper, like it had grown teeth. Aunt Eileen did not move. Tyler whispered, Delta. As if it were a word you paid to hear. Ko lowered the page an inch. For operational security. Specific dates and actions remain restricted. She said, this acknowledgement serves to allow local recognition and to clear the way for public ceremony at City Hall. Behind her, the color guard adjusted stance 1 millimeter, the whole formation moving like a single intention. Sheriff Torres looked over his shoulder and nodded once toward the curb. Someone across the street raised a phone and, catching my eye through the screen, lowered it again. Ko glanced in my direction. With your permission, Colonel, she said softly. I'll read the full paragraph. I nodded. She lifted the page. My parents' house listened to its own air. Ko lifted the page the way a medic lifts a dressing steady. Clean. No drama she doesn't need. Colonel Ethan Ward. She read. Is acknowledged for distinguished service to the United States in assignments now declassified in part. This includes command of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta Airborne, and subsequent leadership within Joint Special Operations elements, under U.S. Army Special Operations Command. For reasons of operational security. Specific locations. Dates. Unit composition. Methods. And associated personnel remain restricted. This acknowledgement is issued to enable appropriate local recognition and to authorize participation in public honors, as determined by public affairs. The words didn't land so much as settle. A fine dust you only notice because your breathing changes. The house absorbed them in stages. First the floor. Then the walls. Then the people. Mason blinked and said, not to anyone. No way. It came out small. An answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. A spoon slid off a dessert plate somewhere near the dining room and hit the hardwood with a sound that would be forgettable on any other night. It sounded like gravity remembering its job. Robert's jaw unclenched just enough to prove it had been clenched. He didn't look at me. He looked at the paper like he was trying to read the parts still blacked out between the lines. Linda's hands had stopped moving. She held the apron like a flag whose country no longer existed. Tyler spoke the word commander like a man repeating an address to make sure he has it right. Then he stood up because his body needed to show it had gotten the message. Ko kept her voice even. By request of the unit, and per current policy, individual decorations and citations associated with sensitive operations will not be read. They remain on record. She lowered the page a fraction. Colonel Ward's participation in public ceremonies will be limited to what is authorized this week. City Hall recognizes him tonight at 1930. Uncle Gary found his voice and then lost it again. What came out was not a quip, but a breath. And then a hand on his sleeve from someone who had run out of patience. Sheriff Torres shifted his boots on the walkway, catching the first flicker of porch light from a neighbor's house as curiosity spread down the block. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. The uniform does some work for you if you let it. Lila forgot about her phone long enough to look at my face. I didn't give her anything to caption. Ko glanced at me. Sir, you may speak if you wish. 1 sentence is customary. You are not required. 100 sentences auditioned and were told to go home. I settled on the one that fit into a breath. Thank you, I said. Respect to the people who can't be named. Ko nodded. The small salute of a professional to another. She turned slightly toward the color guard. We'll conclude this inside acknowledgement, she said. Then stepped to the curb for the mayor's statement. Robert found a posture that read, as cooperation, if you didn't know the man. That's sufficient, he said. His voice tried to be the voice of a host who had expected exactly this. It didn't quite make it. Linda's eyes flicked to Mason, as if she could borrow his expression to wear for a minute. Mason was looking at the floor again. And the floor had no expression to lend. Aunt Eileen didn't let go of my sleeve until she had to, so the color guard could pivot. Her fingers left small crescents in the fabric. I knew there was a reason, she said under her breath. Not for evidence, but for herself. Tyler started to clap because that is what you do when you don't know what else to do. But Ko cut it off with the kind of nod that says later. Outside. In the place we built for this. He dropped his hands and put them in his pockets. As if the sound could stay there. The color guard backed as one to the threshold. Heels kissing the line where tile becomes porch. I could smell night now cut grass. Hot asphalt cooling. Something fried 4 houses down. Ko stepped aside to let the formation lead. And the rifles became just wood and tradition again, instead of the past stepping into my parents' living room. We filed to the curb in a narrow procession that felt nothing like a parade, and everything like a decision. Sheriff Torres made a small lane with one arm and a look. And the street obeyed. The mayor's sedan door opened at the rhythm of this particular evening. Alicia Grant stood out into the heat. Blazer on. Flats instead of heels. A folder under her arm. She'd probably told her assistant not to forget 3 times. Colonel Ward, she said, and reached her hand toward me. Thank you for allowing us to do this properly. She looked past me for a half second, taking in the house. The cluster of relatives. The color guard waiting at ease. We'll keep it brief. Ko nodded to the guard. Colors. Post, she said. The 2 flags moved to their spots without hurry and without error. The rifles settled. A neighbor across the street took a picture and, realizing the moment demanded something, lowered the phone before the shutter sound could break it. The mayor opened the folder, and I saw the seal of the city that had once been the entire map of my childhood. Whereas, she began, because proclamations in America begin that way. The city of San Marcos recognizes distinguished service in our community. And whereas Colonel Ethan Ward has been acknowledged by the Department of Defense for leadership within UPRFORBER, S. Army Special Operations, including command of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta Airborne, now. Therefore, her voice carried clean but not loud. The block listened because it didn't know how not to. Behind me, Linda had come to the sidewalk and stopped just shy of the first seam in the concrete. It was as if the house had given her its border to stand on. Robert stayed at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed without meaning to be. Mason stood in the no man's land between them. Hands empty, tie still loosened. A man suddenly conscious of how much a knot matters. The mayor held up a framed copy of the proclamation with my name written in a font I'd seen on 100 city documents that never had anything to do with me. We invite you, she said, to accept this as an expression of our thanks. And we invite this family to be proud. Pride is a strange garment. It fits wrong if you're not used to it. I kept my face where it belonged. Sheriff Torres took one step to the side to give the angle to the cameras that weren't supposed to be there but always are. Ko shifted to stand just behind the mayor's right shoulder. Because that's where clean lines live. When the mayor extended the frame, Robert did a thing I did not expect him to do. He stepped forward, one small step out of his shadow, and reached as if to take it on behalf of the family, on behalf of the house. Maybe. Ko saw it and, without looking like she was doing anything, redirected the moment with a smile and a palm. For the colonel. Sir. Robert froze. His hand an inch from a thing he thought would fix him. I took the frame. It was lighter than it looked. Would you like to say anything? The mayor asked. But it wasn't pressure. It was the kind of question that lets a man choose his own size. Only this. I said. Half of what deserves thanks can't be said out loud. The other half is the city that lets the quiet work be done. Thank you. Someone across the street said amen like they were surprised to hear themselves say it. The mayor nodded once, satisfied that the words had hit their marks. We'll see you again at City Hall, she said quietly. For just me and Ko to hear. 2 blocks at 1930. Yes. Ma'am, Ko said. We stood there for a breath. The colors bright against a sky that had turned the kind of blue that only lives for 2 minutes a day. And then the guard lifted and pivoted, and we were suddenly people again. Not symbols. The mayor shook my hand a second time. Shook Robert's once because he was there, and because she is good at the job. And then got into the sedan, and the door closed with that city car sound that says back to the next thing. The neighbors found their porches. The block remembered Monday was coming. Sheriff Torres tipped his hat. Evening, he said. Which in Texas means, this happened. Inside the screen door, the house waited, deciding how much of the last 10 minutes to admit it had seen. Co glanced down at her page, slid it back into the portfolio, and gave me a professional nod that included an unspoken question. Anything else inside? Just one thing. I said, a cup of coffee to go. Black, she asked. Black. I said, inside. Linda had already moved to the urn without me asking. She poured into a paper cup and held it out. Our fingers didn't touch. Congratulations, she said, and figured out halfway through the word that it wasn't the word she meant. But there wasn't time to find another. Robert had his arms free again and didn't know what to do with them. Mason looked at the proclamation like it had thrown off more light than it had any right to. Tyler exhaled the way people exhale when a commercial finally ends. Lila lifted her phone and then, with an effort that embarrassed her, lowered it. Aunt Eileen reached for my sleeve the way she had been doing all night, and then didn't. Because she had taught herself once, a man stands up on his own. Co tucked a card into Robert's palm. Formalities. City Hall. Where to park. Who to call if he wanted to speak after all, and then turned to me. We'll regroup at 1925 on the East Steps, she said. It'll be 5 minutes max. See you there, I said. She nodded to the guard. The rifles turned into furniture again and dissolved into the night. The door snicked shut. The house had its air back. So did I. The house settled into the kind of silence that thinks it's ordinary. Coffee steam lifted. Shoes found their corners. A cousin laughed too loudly and then stopped. As if the sound had broken, a rule no one remembered writing. I stood with the paper cup Linda had handed me and felt the heat work through the cardboard. Robert got there first, the narrative. The attempt. We'll keep the city hall bit small, he said to the room. But his eyes were on me. No need for all this. Attention. This is still Mason's night. It can be both. I said. It should be. Linda rubbed a thumbprint off the counter that didn't exist. We can drive separate, she offered. The compromise of a woman trying to herd weather. Whoever wants to go can go. Aunt Eileen looked at Robert. I'm going, she said. No permission asked. Uncle Gary opened his mouth. Tyler touched his sleeve and, for once, shook his head. Not it, he muttered. Mason hovered between the hearth and the hallway. Tie loosened. Palms empty. His face wearing an expression I recognized from boys who see a map redraw itself under their boots. You knew, he said. Not angry yet. Just newly fluent in the obvious. You knew all night and let me do all that. It was classified until it wasn't, I said. And PAO set the window. Tonight. Not my choosing. And you chose to do it here. Robert said. A statement dressed as a question. I chose to give you a heads up. I said. A letter. 10 minutes. No cameras inside. You could have read it an hour ago. I felt the weight of the envelope in my jacket as if it had grown heavier from not being opened. Mason breathed out through his nose. You hijacked my promotion dinner. I kept my eyes on him. Your dinner isn't smaller because another truth is finally allowed to be spoken. Feels smaller, he said. Feelings aren't measures. Aunt Eileen said. And somehow no one told her to hush. Lila had her phone in her hand and shame in her throat. She tucked the phone into her back pocket like a talisman that had failed. Linda's voice softened without collapsing. Ethan. If the city is going to, if there will be photographs, I'd like to know where to stand. She said. So I don't stand where I don't belong. Next to me. I said. If you want. Robert's jaw cocked. Don't choreograph my wife. He said. I just answered her question. I said. The doorbell reflex twitched in the room. That lingering echo of protocol. And then quiet filled the gap it left. Through the screen. The block had already started returning to its own life porch lights. Sprinklers. A bicycle wheel clicked somewhere down the sidewalk. Mason's phone vibrated. He glanced. Ignored it. then looked again when it didn't stop. He frowned. XO, he said to no one, and stepped toward the laundry room where quiet lives in houses like ours. He answered with his officer voice. Yes. Sir. A pause stretched. No. Sir. We're at home. Yes. Sir. That was family. Understood. He held the phone away for a second like it had heat. Yes. Sir. I'll be in at 0 to 6. Roger. He lowered the phone and blinked. What Robert asked. Mason slid the phone into his pocket. They saw Lila's live. He said without looking at her. And a neighbor's clip got shared. XO says to take everything down and remember I'm in uniform, even when I'm not talking into a mic. No bar. Report at 06 to talk through judgment and bearing. Tyler winced. My bad. He said automatically. As if the apology could be applied like spackle. Lila's eyes glassed. I'm sorry. She whispered. I didn't think, that's the problem. Linda said. And then shut her mouth on the rest. Robert lifted his chin. Trying to reclaim altitude. You'll explain that we were celebrating at home, he said to Mason. As if explaining had ever been the same as undoing. This is ridiculous. It's the Army. Mason said. Ridiculous is spelled R-E-G-S. He tugged his tie straight and seemed to wake up inside his own collar. I need 15 minutes alone, he added, and moved past us toward the back porch without waiting for permission. The room emptied by degrees. Cousins carried plates to the sink because that's what people do when there's nothing to say. Uncle Gary found the door and misread it for an exit line. Tyler asked if anyone needed ice, then decided no one did. Lila hovered at the edge of apology like a swimmer near cold water. Linda wiped a clean spot again. I wish they'd called me. She said to the air. I'd have told them he's a good boy. He's a second lieutenant. I said. Soft. That's not a boy. He'll be fine. Someone needed to remind him the uniform is rented, not owned. Robert turned on me. This, he said. And the word held more freight than grammar. This is exactly why I didn't want theatrics. They see a camera. They make a show. They saw a drink and a crown and a sentence about showing up. I said, none of that came from a color guard. You brought the mayor to my porch. He said, I brought the truth. I said, the mayor came because that's her job. He laughed once. Short and without warmth. You've always had a way of sounding like duty and ending up in the middle of a mess. Sometimes duty is walking into the mess because it's where things are failing quietly. I said, you taught me that when I was 8, and we dug out the drainage ditch in the rain so the yard wouldn't flood. He didn't like how quickly the memory obeyed us. I taught you to rake leaves. He said, you taught yourself the rest. Captain Coe's text buzzed. Press line is building. City can seat Ward Family Row 2 if you want it. Names ETA 1925 E steps. I held the phone where only Linda could see. She met my eyes. Then looked at Robert. I'm going, she said. Row 2. She didn't ask him. She told the room. Eileen, she added, though she already knew. Always. Eileen said. Robert rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers. The gesture he uses when a bolt won't thread. I will not be paraded. He said. No one's asking you to be. I said. They're offering chairs. He stared at the cup in my hand as if it were an argument. I built this house. He said. I know where the chairs are. The back door creaked. Mason came in. She properly set now. Face calmer. He looked older by an inch. I'll go. He said. City Hall. Then home. Then I sleep. XO at 06. He looked at me and, to his credit, did not flinch. Don't make a speech. He added. If they hand you a mic, just don't. They won't. I said. And I won't. He nodded once the, yes, you give a man you aren't ready to forgive but are ready to stand beside in public, and turned to Linda. Mom. You should come. He said. It'll look wrong if you don't. Linda blinked at the phrase look wrong, but accepted its utility for the night. I have my flats, she said, and went to get her purse. Robert looked at Mason as if he'd been betrayed by math. You don't have to chase anyone's optics, he said. I have to stop making problems bigger. Mason said, Tonight. Going makes them smaller. Eileen put a hand on Robert's arm. Come sit in the second row with your wife, she said. Or stand on the porch and watch the taillights. Those are the choices. He pulled his arm back, but not with malice. He looked at me like a man who has to pick which thing to hate least. I'll drive myself, he said. I'm not riding in your car. I wasn't going to offer, I said. And his mouth tightened because I had taken away the refusal he wanted to spend. Linda reappeared with a cardigan and a purse that used to belong to her mother. Lila, scrubbed with guilt, said, I'll stay and clean. And Linda said, Go with us. So Lila nodded and went to change her shoes. Tyler volunteered that he'd lock up. No one answered. He volunteered again. Quieter. Captain Coe's text chimed a second time. Cameras at East Steps only. No questions tonight. We'll keep it tight. 5 minutes. I said to the room that was still my parents' house even when it didn't want to be. We should go. Robert looked around at the trim and the photographs and the paint color he had chosen to pretend arguments never stick to a wall. This isn't pride, he said to no one in particular. This is spectacle. Sometimes spectacle is what you get when you refused pride long enough. Eileen said. Mason checked his phone again, then slid it face down on the counter like he'd learned one new thing today and wanted to protect it. He met my eyes. I'll walk behind you, he said. Not because you're whatever you are, because it's simpler in a crowd. Copy, I said. We moved toward the door. The small procession of a family trying on a different order. The house didn't stop us. The threshold was just wood again. On the porch? The air had cooled 0.5 degrees. A neighbor nodded from across the street with the careful distance of someone who has decided not to misunderstand you anymore tonight. The sky had turned that brief ink between blue and black. Behind me. Robert paused. Ethan, he said. I turned. If anyone asks me what you do, he said. What do I say? I thought about all the wrong answers and the one right one. You say I work for the army, I said. And that you're proud. He nodded as if trying on a word he hadn't worn in years. We'll see, he said. We stepped off the porch. The block watched without watching. The city waited 2 turns away. Mason fell in behind my left shoulder. Exactly 1 pace back. Exactly where a younger brother, who is also a lieutenant, might choose to learn how to walk beside a thing that doesn't need him to, but will let him anyway. The east steps of City Hall were dressed like a postcard bunting just this side of modest. 2 lampposts humming against the evening. A line of cameras penned by nylon stanchions. Captain Coe materialized out of angles and tape marks. All quiet efficiency and soft commands. Ward family row 2, she said. And an usher in a city badge led us to a cluster of folding chairs with white cards clipped to the backs. Ward Linda. Ward Robert. Ward Eileen. Ward Mason. Robert eyed his card like it had opinions. I'll stand, he said. You'll sit, Aunt Eileen replied, and didn't wait for his agreement. She slid into her chair, as if she'd been practicing for this exact seat all her life. Linda sat beside her, purse under her feet. Hands folded so tightly the knuckles went pale. Mason hovered at the aisle. 1 step behind where he'd been all day, close enough to count as with us. Far enough to keep an exit. Coe touched my elbow. Colonel. East rail with me, she said. We'll keep you out of the camera cones until the call. She angled me to a strip of shadow near the stone balustrade where the seal of the city glowed like a coin. 5 minutes. No Q&A. 1 frame for media front page and the evening reel. Then done. From the pen. A local reporter with a tie he'd ironed in the car mouthed a question. Coe shook her head with a smile that managed to be polite and firm in the same syllable. After, she mouthed back. Which meant never. The band from the high school struck a restrained chord that pretended it wasn't a band from a high school. The color guard took the center seam of the steps and posted without a wobble. All rise, a city staffer said into a hidden mic. And we did. The block rising with us. Mayor Grant kept it brief. Like she'd promised. A second proclamation. A challenge coin that felt cold in my hand. The kind of words that don't pretend to know what they can't. This city has always honored quiet work, she said. Sometimes the quiet becomes a name. Tonight we thank Colonel Ward. And we also thank the people who love him. Her eyes found row 2. And for a second, Linda forgot to hold her own hands together. Applause is a strange weather. It can be honest. Or it can be polite. Or it can be both. This was both. It washed the steps, ran down the railings, and left the stone exactly as it had been. As the sound eased, an older man in a battered Vietnam cap lifted 2 fingers to his brow from the sidewalk. It wasn't a full salute, too informal, too personal, but he meant it. I gave him back the only version of respect that fit the space, a nod that said, "I see you." He touched the brim once more and disappeared into the thin row of maple trees, like he'd only been passing through to return a debt. Ko nudged me a half step forward for the frame. 1 shutter burst. A second for the extra angle. Then her hand was on my sleeve again, steering me back into shadow before the questions could learn to say themselves out loud. On the aisle, Lila stood up halfway, then sat down hard. Her phone stayed in her pocket. It looked heavy there. Like a lesson. Robert leaned his forearms on his knees and stared at the proclamation as if distance might decode it. Then, without drama, he slid a finger under the flap of the envelope he'd finally pocketed at home and opened it. He read the first line. He read the second. His mouth moved on the third, silently forming words he thought he already knew. The letter was short, a PAO read ahead. The window for declassification. A note that I had declined to include family details. A line in plain language. This acknowledgement does not change any member's obligations or opportunities. It is not a favor extended to relatives. He blinked once. He read it again. Ladies and gentlemen, the city staffer said, voice gentle, we invite you to remain for 1 minute of silence for those who did not come home. Silence has different shapes. This one was not the heavy kind from my parents' living room. It was clean, like a flag folded correctly, in the quiet. A woman in her 50s stepped to the edge of the pen and rested her hands on the rail. She didn't call out. She just waited until I looked at her. Then she mouthed, "Thank you," formed the words carefully, and tapped the corner of a folded program against her chest twice. Gold star pins don't need to be seen. I nodded. She nodded back. Nothing else needed to happen. The minute passed. The band found a closing note. The color guard lifted and pivoted, releasing the evening back to itself. People began to stand in the staggered way. People stand when they know there's a traffic light at the end of whatever this moment is. Ko breathed out like she'd been holding a box on a shelf. That's it, she said. You're clear. She pointed at a small table near the column. Press will peel off. If you want the frame for your mother, we'll print one. I'll take one for row 2. I said. We moved along the rail. A cameraman tried a question over the stanchion colonel. Is it true? And Ko gave him the look that turns questions into tomorrow. He lowered the boom and settled for a cutaway of the seal. Mason came to my shoulder. His tie was set properly now. His jaw, too. XO texted. He said under the hum. He saw the clip. Says, wear it well and shut up about it. That's 2 good sentences. I said. He glanced at the color guard. At the steps. At the press line that had already lost interest and was hunting for the next thing that would become a title. You didn't have to do this, he said. He spoke it like a fact he hadn't decided to like. I didn't get a vote, I said. But I did get to choose how not to make it your problem. He digested that, then nodded once. The kind you give yourself more than the other man. I'll drive, Mom, he said. Roberts, driving himself. Copy, I said. Linda had drifted toward the table for the print and was talking to a volunteer about paper stock as if it were a recipe. Eileen stood with her, one hand on Linda's shoulder, anchoring without making a show of it. Robert stayed seated 1 beat longer than the rest of row 2, letter open on his knee. Then he stood, folded the page with care it had not been given earlier, and slid it into his pocket like he'd decided paper can be heavier than wood. He found me not far from the base of the steps. Your letter says this doesn't change anything we do, he said. Voice even. It doesn't, I said. But it changes what I thought I knew, he added. And looked at the lamppost because looking at me was a different decision. About you. About what a night like this means. I let the space exist. It means I'm off the hook in exactly one way. I said, I don't have to pretend to be smaller to keep the room comfortable. He breathed through his nose. For Robert. That's a paragraph. I'm still angry. He said, I know. I said, I'll be at the house. He said, I'll put on coffee. It was an apology without surrender. The only kind he could afford. He stepped away. As he did, the Vietnam vet surfaced again long enough to clap Robert once on the shoulder in passing. Not hard. Not friendly. Just an acknowledgement of a man walking toward a conversation he didn't want to have. Robert took the clap like a coin, the kind you aren't sure you can spend but keep anyway. At the column table, the volunteer slid a glossy print into a paper sleeve. One for row 2, she said. And Linda's mouth quivered in a way that might be a smile next week. She tucked the sleeve into her purse as if rain were possible. We began to peel away the block. The band. The press. The evening. Poe boxed her portfolio and came by for a final word. There'll be a 1-paragraph release at 0900. She said. Name. Unit. Tonight's image. That's it. You're back under the usual rules after that. Understood. I said. She hesitated. Your father, does he need a call from me? She asked. It wasn't protocol. It was professional kindness. No. I said. He needs his own kitchen. She squeezed my elbow once. East steps did their job. She said. Go do yours. We walked toward the lot. Mason fell into step behind my left shoulder again. 1 pace back. And didn't fidget. On the far side of the fountain, the woman with the folded program had found a bench. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. At the curb, Linda stopped. Ethan, she said, eyes still on the paper sleeve in her purse. What do I say to people who ask what you do? Tell them I work for the army. I said, tell them you're proud. She nodded once. I am, she said. And the second word cost her. And she paid it. Headlights swung across the square. Robert's truck peeled away from the curb without signaling. The way he's always left places on his own terms. Even when there are none. Eileen clicked her tongue and slid her arm through Linda's. Let's not make him drink the first cup alone, she said. Mason unlocked his sedan. 2 minutes behind you, he told them. I'll follow. They went. The square resumed being a square. I stood there long enough to feel the night take its breath back and give mine to me. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. Area code I recognized from a place I was not supposed to recognize. Heard the city did it right. Tell your brother to polish his boots and mind his bearing. The signature was just an initial and an eagle emoji, which felt like a joke someone had earned the right to make. I slipped the phone away and turned toward the street where home waited with the lights on and the coffee machine empty. On the edge of the steps, a city worker pulled up stanchions, coiling the nylon into neat circles. Good night, Colonel, he said without looking up. Night, I said. And then I headed for the conversation I didn't want, but knew needed me more than any speech ever could. The house had calmed itself by the time we came back from City Hall. The porch light cut a clean triangle on the foyer floor. In the kitchen, the coffee machine hummed like it had never stopped. Robert stood with his back to us. Palm on the counter. 2 mugs already set out. He didn't look up when we walked in. He never looks up first. Linda slipped past me and took the chair nearest the window. Eileen sat beside her like she'd been assigned as ballast. Mason set the proclamation on the counter and kept his hands on either side of it, as if keeping it from sliding away. Robert poured and handed mugs like he was arming people for a same fight, different night. You got what you wanted, he said. The speech. The coin. The picture. Now we put this back where it belongs, quiet. Mason's got early call. We all have work in the morning. It was quiet. Eileen said, that's what made it land. Robert turned the handle of his own mug until it faced exactly forward. You want to explain something? Ethan, he asked without looking at me. Explain why the only time you show up, you bring a parade. I brought a timeline. I said. PAO said it. I kept it smaller than it could have been. Could have been. He repeated. Like the phrase tasted bad. You had a choice about here. You made your choice. I made a courtesy call. I said. I gave you a letter. And 10 minutes to read it. And a chance not to be surprised. You chose not to open it. He finally looked at me. His eyes were the color of the ditch water we used to clear when it rained. You chose to be gone when your grandfather died, he said. Not a new sentence, but an old one he still liked saying. You chose to be gone when your mother was in the hospital. You chose to be gone so often that gone is the only way I know you. Linda flinched at hospital. Not because the fact was wrong, but because facts have edges when you say them wrong. Eileen's hand slid onto her wrist and stayed. I didn't choose the timing of the work, I said. I chose the work. That's on me. And what about choosing us, he asked. I did. I said. Every time I kept the mess of my job on me and not in your house. That was choosing you. Tonight wasn't my choice. But how to do it here, how not to disrespect your roof, that was my choice. Mason cut in. Voice low. You could have done it on the steps without bringing it through the door. He said. You could have left the house out of it. The door is where the line is. I said. That's why it mattered. Linda's voice was soft. Careful. It did matter, she said. And the second word cost her again. And she paid it again. I don't know what to do with all of it. But it mattered. Robert took that in and filed it somewhere he wasn't going to show us. He lifted his mug and didn't drink. You know what I do with the word colonel? He asked. I put it in the same box with the word absent. Those two words don't belong in the same box. Eileen said. They do in this house. He said. And then he set the mug down so carefully that it made no sound. Mason drew a breath and let it out slow. XO texted again. He said. 05:45 instead of 0 to 6. He says I'm going to love the phrase bearing and judgment by the end of the week. Good. I said. They're verbs before they're nouns. Robert ignored the exchange. Since you like boxes, he said. Here's one I keep for you. He opened the drawer by the stove and pulled out a cracked cigar box I hadn't seen since high school. He slid it across the counter. Inside were pieces of me he'd kept without my permission, an old Ranger School letter, a unit coin from a battalion that hadn't existed in a decade, a photocopy of a casualty list from a training accident 3 bases ago, with my name not on it but a boy's whose face I could still draw in my sleep. Under the stack, a wrinkled program from a funeral I wasn't at. Don't do that, Linda said. But she didn't reach to stop him. You think I don't know what uniforms cost, Robert said. Eyes on the box. You think I haven't paid any? My brother shipped out in '83. Beirut. He wore a marine dress blues once in my mother's kitchen and made her cry because she thought a uniform meant a life with lines on it instead of holes. He never wore it again. He wore camis and jokes and told me not to worry. October 23rd. The news showed concrete and smoke and bodies. I learned about uniforms from a silence that lasted 30 years. I knew the date like my own social. The room adjusted itself to fit the sentence. Mason didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Tommy, Eileen said quietly. He was kind to me. He taught me how to back the truck without clipping the mailbox. Robert nodded once. Tommy, he said. You looked like him under those lights tonight. Ethan. Only difference is, they brought him home in a flag, and they brought you home to a microphone. Both ways. A kitchen goes quiet and tries to decide what to do with pride. I don't like either. I can't fix Beirut. I said. I can fix what I do in your house. You can't fix what you already broke. He said. Then I can stop breaking it more. I said. Starting with this, I won't call anyone about Mason. He'll carry his own. He'll learn the right way. I won't write a letter, or pick up a phone, or ask anyone to look at him different. That's not what tonight was for. Mason looked at me and, for the first time tonight, something like respect got a chance to breathe. Thank you, he said. It was small, but it wasn't a loner. Robert turned the box 90 degrees. Then back. You brought a letter tonight that told me you can't do favors, he said. Fine. Here's mine. He tapped the cigar box. If you're going to be what that paper says you are, you don't get to be a ghost here anymore. No more 5 years gone and a postcard. You can't show up to take the heat out of a rumor and then vanish. You want to be a son. Be one in the off-camera hours. That's the only way it counts. I felt a heat in my chest. I hadn't felt since I was 19 and thought the world could be made right by will. You want me at Thanksgiving? I said. More statement than question. I want you at the ugly days. He said. The ones with no proclamations and too much laundry and a busted water heater? I want you when I get the wrong letter and need someone to read it out loud so I know if it's a bill or a threat. I want you when your mother has lab work and won't tell me what the doctor said the first time. I want you when your aunt needs the roof guy's number because she lost it again. If you're staying in the army, you still owe this house some hours. Pay them. Linda made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob. That, she said, I can live with. Eileen squeezed her hand. Me too, she said. Mason rubbed the back of his neck. Good, he said. Because I'm going to be at the ugly days too. And I'm going to need someone to tell me when I'm being an idiot. That's my specialty, Eileen said. And a corner of her mouth lifted. Robert looked at me like he was trying to see if I'd survive what he'd just asked for. Well, I said. I can't promise a calendar I don't control. But I can promise that when I'm stateside, I'm not here once every leap year. You'll see me. Not for parades. For coffee. He nodded once. Which, in Robert, is the same as signing a contract. Then pour, he said. I picked up the pot and filled the mugs. Mine last. Linda set a plate of cookies on the table that no one had asked for, and everyone took anyway. Mason rolled his shoulders and looked at the sink like it had something to tell him. Eileen stood and found the step stool and reached for the high shelf where she keeps the good cups, because she decided the cheap ones had done enough work tonight. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. Same area code as the text from the square. I thumbed it open under the edge of the counter. Heard you went home and did the hard part. Tell Robert some of us still mark the 23rd of October 2083. Tell him Tommy's name gets said at a bar in Fayetteville every October. See. I looked at Robert across the kitchen. He was watching the steam lift from his mug as if it could make a picture. What, he asked? Catching the shift in my eyes. Nothing you have to handle tonight, I said. Just a message from a man who knew your brother. Robert's knuckles went white on the handle before he remembered to let them relax. Who, he asked? Not like a dement, but like a man checking a door he thought he'd locked. Someone who keeps count. I said. He says Tommy's name gets said in the right places. Robert's mouth flattened and then, just enough to notice. Unflattened. Good, he said. Voice rough. Good. The coffee steamed. The clock over the stove ticked the loud way it only does after ceremonies. Mason's phone buzzed again, and he flipped it over without looking. Eileen took the stool back to the pantry. Linda pushed the plate of cookies closer to Robert, and didn't press him to take one. 0545. Mason said to the room. I should go. You should, Robert said. And polish your boots. Mason almost smiled. Already did, he said. And picked up the proclamation and tucked it under his arm like homework. We stood up in a staggered way that looked like we'd rehearsed it. At the doorway, Robert stopped me with a hand on my sleeve that wasn't a grab. What do I say when the neighbors ask about the cars and the flags, he asked. Say the city said thank you. I said. And that we made coffee. He let go of my sleeve. That I can do, he said. We turned toward the hall. The house breathed the way a house breathes when it has decided to make room for something without knowing where it will fit. My phone buzzed one more time, same number. 2 words. I put the phone face down and picked up the pot to refill Robert's cup before he had to ask. I woke to the noise a Texas house makes before dawn. Air vent ticking. Water heater knocking once, like it wanted to be remembered. The digital clock glowed 0502. In the hall. The light under Mason's door went from a stripe to nothing. His steps crossed the hardwood with the care of a man trying not to make a second mistake on the same night. The front door eased shut. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. XO moved it to 0545. Bring your boots and your patience. MFAR. Coffee first. The kitchen smelled like a truce that hadn't been signed yet. Robert was already there. Robetied. Spectacles low on his nose. Turning the filter basket in his hands like it had secrets. He didn't say good morning. Neither did I. We stood 2 paces apart and did the work that keeps people from speaking too quickly, grinding. Filling. Waiting for the first drip, the water heater knocked again. Robert glanced toward the utility closet. "It's been doing that," he said. "Anode rod's probably gone." I answered. "We'll check it after breakfast." He didn't say thank you, but he set a Phillips head on the counter like he'd been planning to. We drank in silence until silence wasn't doing any more work. Robert set his mug down. "Tommy's XO called me once," he said. "Months before Beirut. Told me Tommy had trouble with bearing because he laughed too loud in the motor pool. I told him there are worse problems to have." He lifted the mug again and didn't drink. They all turned out to be worse. I told him about the text, about a man who still said Tommy's name out loud in a bar in North Carolina in October. Robert looked at the far wall as if there were a window there to look out of. "I didn't know anyone remembered," he said. And the word remembered sounded like it had weight. "We changed the anode rod," the heater complained, then settled into a steady hum. It wasn't a fix for anything that needed more than plumbing, but it felt like the right kind of repair for a house that had decided to try. Mason came back at 0710. Boots clean. Face pale. The way faces get after someone in a starched uniform has asked them to consider their future with nouns like judgment. He set his cover on the counter and found his breath. "XO made me recite the social media policy from memory," he said. "I didn't know there was one. And it turns out I've known it all my life." "How bad?" I asked. "Not bad if I learn fast," he said. He gave me a homework assignment. Cadet talk at Texas State ROTC on Thursday. Topic is bearing under attention. He said I should speak from experience and not pretend I know anything I don't. "That's a good assignment," I said. Mason looked at Robert, then at me. "I figured I'd tell them about a guy who thought applause meant respect," he said, "and how he learned the difference in one night." "You'll be fine," Robert said gruffly. "Just don't say like every fourth word." Mason's mouth twitched in a way that was almost a smile. "Copy," he said. He took the cover and disappeared down the hall. The sound of a younger man deciding he might enjoy not being wrong all the time. Around 10. A white Ford with veteran plates pulled to the curb. Robert's eyes cut to the window. "You expecting anyone?" he asked. "No," I said. But my pocket buzzed. "Out front. Don't salute me. This is..." He was marine down to the shoes, high and tight, gone to gray. Creases like decisions. A face that had made other men straighten their collars. He carried nothing but an envelope and a coin. "Robert Ward?" he asked. Voice a gravel road. "I'm Chuck McCaffrey, USMC. Retired." He glanced at me. "I texted your boy." He didn't offer a hand. He looked past me to the family pictures on the hallway wall. Found the one with Tommy wearing a tan uniform and a smile that thought it would last longer than it did. "That's him," McCaffrey said softly, as if he'd been rehearsing the line for 30 years. Robert didn't move. "You knew my brother?" he asked. I knew his name and his laugh. McCaffrey said, "BLT 1/8. 1st Platoon." He gave me his poncho liner on a cold night in the barracks because I'd mailed mine home to my fiancée like an idiot. He swallowed. I never got to mail it back. We sat at the kitchen table like people do when the conversation is too big for a porch. McCaffrey set the coin on the wood. Marine Corps emblem scarred from being in pockets longer than it had been in velvet. He slid the envelope across to Robert. "This is a rubbing from the memorial in Jacksonville," he said. "And a photograph somebody took in '84 of the wall. They're not good photos. They're what we had." Robert opened the envelope with the care you use when you're afraid paper will turn into a bird and fly away if you move too fast. He touched the charcoal letters with a thumb like a man testing a live wire. "Tom, Tove Arde." He inhaled like he'd been underwater a long time and someone had finally told him where the surface was. "Your brother kept 3 of us out of a stupid fight the night before the bombing," McCaffrey said. "He laughed us back to our racks. We were hungover on duty instead of hungover at the gate. I've been telling that story wrong for 40 years. I always make the joke first. I should have started with his name." He turned his head toward me. "I saw the clip from last night. Your city did right. Thought I'd return something nobody asked me to keep." Robert rubbed at the corner of his eye with the heel of his hand, and then did the thing men in our family do when they're caught being human. He rearranged the salt and pepper shakers until they pointed north. "You drove all the way here to hand me a paper?" he asked. It wasn't disdain. It was awe. "Poorly dressed." I drove because your brother gave me a blanket. McCaffrey said. Some debts aren't for the mail. He stood. There's a VFW on Hopkins. 6 o'clock tonight. Couple of Marines meet there every October to say the names. We don't wait for the anniversaries we don't like. You come by if you want. No speeches. Just names. He looked at Robert's hands. At the way the knuckles had found the edge of the table. Bring the picture from the hallway if you feel mean. Robert nodded once. The way a man does when his mouth isn't sure yet but his bones have already decided. We'll come, he said. Then he corrected himself. I'll come. If they'll have an old man and a long memory, they will. McCaffrey said. He looked at me like he was measuring the distance between men who know the same kind of silence. Semper Fi, he added. And the words in a kitchen that had only ever held army talk sounded right anyway. When he left, the house felt larger by exactly one name. Robert kept his hand on the rubbing like he was worried it would fade if he let go. Linda came in from the backyard with a handful of basil and stopped dead when she saw the paper on the table. Is that she began? It's Tommy, Robert said. And the way he said the name made it a right he was taking back. We ate sandwiches standing up because sitting down felt ceremonial, and none of us could aim our feelings that precisely yet. Around noon, Mason reappeared in a t-shirt and boots. Civilian enough to count as off-duty. He spotted the rubbing, stepped closer, and read the name out loud. I didn't know there was a rubbing, he said. There is now, Robert answered. 6 o'clock. VFW. You'll come. Yes. Sir. Mason said. And he didn't say it like an officer to a superior. He said it like a son to a father on a day when the air had changed. My phone buzzed again at 1410. XO wants me to remind you both. Discretion isn't silence. It's choosing what the room needs. Mason had forwarded the message because he thought it belonged on our table. We spent the afternoon doing the kind of work that looks like chores if you don't know what it's for. Eileen made a list and crossed off things that had been on it for years, because nobody had thought to put them on paper until today. I reseated a door that had never closed right. Linda pulled the good cups back down and decided they would be everyday cups from now on. Robert took the picture of Tommy off the hallway wall and cleaned the glass until his hands stopped shaking. At 1730, we stood in the foyer in a line that didn't feel like a line so much as a set of intentions. Robert held the frame. Linda carried the paper sleeve from City Hall. Mason checked his boots one more time with a cloth he pretended he just happened to have. Eileen had her keys. I had nothing in my hands for once. Robert glanced at me. If anyone at that hall asks me what you do, he said, I'm going to say you work for the army, and that I'm proud. He didn't put a question at the end. He didn't need to. We stepped out into the evening. The porch light came on by itself this time. The street was quiet in the way neighborhoods are quiet when they know an address is carrying something heavy and are trying not to crowd the walk. A breeze came up. And somewhere a wind chime made a sound like a coin in a jar. At the curb, Robert stopped. Ethan, he said. Yeah, I answered. After we say the names, he said. We come home and you show me how to save that text. The one about October. He lifted the frame. I don't want to lose it. I'll show you, I said. We got in the trucks and went to learn how to say a name out loud without it breaking us. The VFW on Hopkins was all wood and memory. Flags in a neat row. A bell on a shelf that no one touched unless it mattered. Men and women who had once been younger than they believed they'd ever be. Chuck McCaffrey waited by the bulletin board with a styrofoam cup and a nod. Linda chose a table near the wall. Eileen stood behind her chair like a bodyguard. Mason drifted to the back, hands folded, trying not to look like a lieutenant in a room where rank had long since been replaced by years and ghosts. Robert set Tommy's framed photo on the ledge below the charter. He did it slowly, as if a wrong move might set off something no one could pack back into a frame. Chuck tapped the rim of his cup twice. Names, he said. It wasn't a speech. It was a start. One Marine read from a typed sheet. Voice steady enough to lend you some if yours shook. A Navy corpsman read from his phone. Then Chuck looked at Robert. Whenever you're ready, he said. Robert put both hands on the ledge. He leaned in close enough to see his own reflection in the glass. And then he said it in a voice that belonged to the version of him that still believed in firsts. Corporal Tommy Ward. The bell rang once. Small and full. No one clapped. No one moved. You don't clap for gravity. Robert bowed his head like the bell had asked him to, and then remembered to breathe. Mason's jaw found a new line and stayed there. Linda pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the table. Eileen said, "Amen." Quiet enough to be a thread and not a knot. When the names were done, nobody made an ending out of it. The room returned itself by degrees. People folded chairs, refilled cups, pretended to read flyers. Chuck found Robert's shoulder. "You did right by him," he said. "I was late," Robert answered. And the sentence had 30 years of edges on it. "You got here," Chuck said. "That's the only time that counts." Outside, the evening had gone purple. The air smelled like a mechanic's bay and cut grass. Robert and Chuck stood by the curb and shook hands too briefly to be a performance and too long to be an accident. "Semper Fi," Robert said, testing the shape of words he'd never had reason to say. Chuck nodded once and let him keep them. Back at the house, Mason carried the frame like a man who had finally understood what a load something invisible can be. Lila was at the sink when we walked in. Sleeves rolled. Phone, nowhere in sight. She looked at Mason first. "I'm sorry," she said. No explanations. No flowers on the apology. "I didn't think." "You will next time," he said. And it wasn't cruel. It was a promise. Robert handed me his phone without preamble. "Show me how to save the text," he said. We sat at the table and did exactly that. Then set a reminder for October 23rd every year at 1800. He watched my thumb move. He did it himself a second time. "Don't want to forget where it lives," he said. We scanned the rubbing and made 2 copies. One went into the drawer with the birth certificates and the mortgage. One went on the fridge under a magnet shaped like Texas that had been holding up a coupon for a pizza place that closed in 2017. Linda put the coupon in the trash and didn't apologize for it. Mason outlined his Thursday talk on a yellow pad. "Bearing under attention," he wrote at the top. He listed 3 points. "Applause isn't respect. Cameras aren't witnesses. If you're proud, act like it when nobody's filming." He looked up at me. "Add 1. I said. "The uniform is rented. Earn it every day." He wrote that down and underlined it twice. "Tyler came by with a bag of ice because Tyler always comes by with a bag of ice." He stood in the doorway holding it like an offering until Eileen took it and said, "We're flush, honey." And he looked relieved to have done something right. Later, when the house had quieted to the sound of its own heart, Robert fixed the squeak in the hinge at the top of the stairs that had been there since I was 10. He didn't announce it. He didn't look at me to see if I was watching. He took a can of oil out of a paper sack, put 2 drops exactly where they were needed, moved the door twice, and the squeak didn't come back. That was his kind of ceremony. We found the coffee again. Not because it was late, but because it was ours. We sat at the table that had held proclamations and bells and rubbings, and now held nothing but 2 mugs and a plate of cookies down to crumbs. The clock over the stove ticked the quiet way. "You going back soon?" Robert asked. "Turn over at Liberty next week," I said. "Then a stretch I can't put on a calendar." He nodded like rain had been predicted. "Bring your boots and your patience," he said. And for once it was a joke. We didn't talk about rank. We didn't talk about what happens when phones go dark for a month. We talked about lawn care and a leak by the hose bib and whether Mason's truck needed new tires before winter. Linda joined us with a pad and made a list that looked like all the lists we should have made 10 years ago. Eileen added 3 names and 2 phone numbers and a star next to Roof Guy because she'd lost it twice this year and declared she wasn't going to make that mistake a 3rd time. Near midnight, the house went to sleep. The porch light clicked off on a timer somebody had finally adjusted. I stood at the sink and ran water over the coffee pot until the smell of the day thinned. Robert dried it with a towel older than Mason. He hung the towel just so and looked at me with a face that had finally decided what to do with pride. "Son," he said. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a truce. It was a word we hadn't used at the right times and were going to use now. In the off-camera hours, whether we felt smooth at it or not, in the morning, I shaved in the mirror over the hall bath because the light is better there. Mason left before dawn. Boots buffed, bearing 5 degrees straighter than it had been. Linda set 3 mugs out without asking who wanted them. Eileen watered a plant by the window that had never looked so green. Lila opened her notes app and typed the words, ask, before posting. Because sometimes rules need writing down to matter. Robert handed me a small box. Found this when I fixed the hinge. He said. Inside was a dog-eared Polaroid of two boys on the tailgate of a truck in front of a house that used to be ours. Tommy grinning like wind. Me pretending not to. For the drawer, he said. I slid the photo next to the rubbing. That drawer had changed its weight in a single day. So had the house. So had we. Before I left for the airport, I walked to the threshold with my bag and nothing in my hands that I couldn't carry. Robert stood there with his coffee, looking at the triangle of light on the floor like it was a map. He didn't put his hand out. So I did. And he took it. And then he pulled me into a hug that started awkward and ended exactly right. Work for the army, he said into my shoulder. Be the sun when you can. Yes. Sir. I said. On the drive? My phone buzzed. Mason XO says Thursday is yours. Bring a story. I typed back, I'll bring a name. Got yours. 2. He sent a thumbs up and, because he's learning, didn't post a thing. At the gate, I watched the sun come up over a field of luggage carts and shuttle buses. Somewhere across the country, there were doors we'd oiled that wouldn't squeak this morning. Somewhere in a bar in North Carolina, a name would get said next October, and my father wouldn't have to wonder if anyone remembered. My family once called me useless. Delta called me commander. Neither is the job I'm trying to do here. In this house. On this porch. Over this coffee. I'm just a man trying to get better at the quiet work carry names. Fix hinges. Show up for the ugly days. That's the only ceremony that lasts. If you're listening to this and a name comes to mind, someone you still carry, say it out loud. If this story landed, drop a 1, or tell me where you're listening from. And if you want the next story when it's ready, follow along. The right words tend to show up when we make room for them.